Learn English through story. Behind closed doors, the streets of the city buzzed with life as Emma Benson walked down the sidewalk, her heels tapping rhythmically against the pavement. She was the picture of success, an elegant woman in her early 30s, a rising star in the corporate world, with an impeccable career trajectory. She had it all: a prestigious job at a high-powered law firm, a beautiful apartment in the city's most sought-after district, and a husband who, on the surface, seemed to be everything a woman could hope for. Richard Benson was charismatic, handsome, and deeply involved in the upper echelons of society. They were the perfect couple. Yet, as Emma walked the city streets, she felt something stir within her an unease, an unshakable sensation that something was amiss. She couldn't quite pinpoint it, but there was a nagging feeling that no matter how perfect her life seemed, it was unraveling slowly, behind closed doors. Richard had always been the ideal husband: on the surface attentive, affectionate, and charming in public. However, in private, Emma had begun to notice subtle changes. He was distant, often lost in his own world, his work consuming him in a way that left little room for her. Their conversations had become mere exchanges of pleasantries, their laughter now a distant memory. The man she had once fallen deeply in love with seemed to be slipping away, and she was left grappling with the silence between them. It had all started shortly after they moved into their luxurious apartment. It was supposed to be their dream home, a place to build a future, a symbol of their shared success. At first, they reveled in the beauty of the space, hosting dinner parties, inviting friends over, living life as though they were the envy of the world. But slowly, the apartment, with its spacious rooms and high-end finishes, began to feel cold. Emma felt like a visitor in her own home, wandering through the empty halls, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Richard had become increasingly focused on his career, constantly working late, attending high-profile meetings, and traveling for business. He would often come home late, looking exhausted, but never opening up to Emma about what was going on in his life. At first, she told herself it was just the pressures of his job. She told herself it was normal for someone in his position to need space, to have long hours. But over time, the distance between them grew wider. Richard's late nights became longer. His phone calls with colleagues or clients were shrouded in secrecy. He'd become curt with her, his once warm smile now replaced by a cold, distant expression whenever they were alone. One evening, Emma sat in their living room, her gaze fixed on the flickering television. Richard had yet to come home, and it was nearing midnight. She couldn't remember the last time they had shared a quiet evening together. A part of her wanted to call him, to ask where he was, but another part of her resisted. She didn't want to seem desperate, needy, or paranoid, but the silence was unbearable. Just then, the door to their apartment clicked open. Emma's heart skipped a beat, but when she looked up, it wasn't Richard who walked through the door, it was Rachel, the woman who had worked alongside Richard for the past year. Emma's stomach churned, her grip tightening around the glass of wine in her hand. "Good evening, Emma," Rachel greeted her with a forced smile, her tone overly cheerful. "Richard just asked me to drop off some paperwork. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Emma managed a stiff smile, though the unease was evident in her eyes. "Not at all," she replied, her voice tight. "I'm just watching TV, no trouble at all." Rachel nodded, her gaze lingering on Emma, for a moment too long before she left the apartment as quickly as she had entered. The next morning, Emma confronted Richard as soon as he came home. The question that had been building for weeks finally spilled out. "Why was Rachel here last night? It's late. You said you were working late. Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice trembled with a mixture of anger and hurt. Richard froze for a moment, and his expression softened, but only slightly. He ran a hand through his hair. "It was nothing, Emma. She just dropped off some files. You know how it is. Just work." But Emma wasn't convinced. She saw the look in Richard's eyes, the way he couldn't meet her gaze for long. There was something about that moment that left her feeling cold. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on, Richard? This isn't the life we were supposed to have. I don't know who you are anymore." Days turned into weeks, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She continued to push Richard, but his evasiveness only deepened. There was no intimacy anymore, no tenderness in their conversations. He became more withdrawn, spending countless hours on his phone or in his office. The lies he told to cover up his absences became more elaborate. He would promise to come home early, but then he'd work late or disappear for hours on end. Emma tried to ignore her instincts, tried to convince herself that it was just the pressures of his career, but her heart told her otherwise. One afternoon, as Emma returned to the apartment early from work, she caught a glimpse of something she never expected to see. Richard's phone lay on the coffee table, its screen illuminated. Without thinking, she picked it up. The notification was from Rachel. "Can't wait for tonight, just like old times." A sinking feeling lodged in Emma's chest, and for the first time, she didn't hesitate. She opened the message, and then the other ones. Each one sent a cold shiver down her spine as she read their exchanges, flirtatious, intimate, filled with promises of late-night rendezvous. Her hands shook as she set the phone back down, her mind racing, her heart pounding. She had known for weeks that something was off, but now she had the proof. The confrontation was inevitable. Later that evening, Emma waited for Richard to return. When he finally stepped through the door, his usual smile faded as soon as he saw her sitting silently in the living room. "I know about you and Rachel," Emma said, her voice steady, though her insides were in turmoil. "I read the messages. Don't try to deny it." Richard's face drained of color, but he said nothing. "I want the truth, Richard," Emma demanded. "What has been going on behind closed doors? What have you been hiding from me?" Richard sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. He looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt, but also with a strange resignation. "It's been going on for months, Emma," he confessed. "It started with her helping me with work, and one thing led to another. I never meant for you to find out. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why didn't you stop? Why didn't you end it?" Emma's voice cracked, her heart shattering. "I couldn't, Emma. I didn't know how to," he admitted, his voice low. "I didn't know how to tell you the truth." Emma felt her world crumble around her. The foundation of everything she had believed in her marriage, her love, her trust shattering in an instant. Behind closed doors, the man she had trusted had built a different life. And Emma, the woman who had once been confident, independent, and in control, was left standing in the wreckage of their life together. As the days passed, Emma wrestled with her emotions: anger, betrayal, and profound sadness. She no longer recognized the man she had once loved. Their life together, the idealized version of marriage they had built, was nothing but a facade. Behind closed doors, Richard had been living a lie, and now she had to decide what came next. Could she ever trust him again? Could she rebuild her life with him, or was it time to walk away, to reclaim her own sense of identity and self-worth? It wasn't easy, but Emma knew that the choice she faced wasn't about Richard, it was about her. She had allowed herself to be swept up in a world of illusions, of appearances, and of expectations. But now, the truth was laid bare, and it was time for her to decide who she was, what she wanted, and what kind of future she would build for herself. Behind Closed Doors explores the hidden truths that lie beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. It is a story of betrayal, self-discovery, and the painful realization that appearances can often mask the deepest wounds. The story encourages readers to reflect on their own relationships, on the things that are hidden from view, and on the importance of honesty and trust in building meaningful connections. It is a reminder that behind the closed doors of our lives, it is not only our actions, but also our integrity and our willingness to face the truth that define us. This beginning sets the stage for a long and evolving narrative, one that explores the psychological, emotional, and relational intricacies of betrayal and healing. If you would like further details or a more in-depth continuation, feel free to ask. In the days following the confrontation, Emma felt as though her life had been turned upside down. Richard's betrayal weighed heavily on her heart, a constant reminder of the trust that had been shattered. She couldn't bring herself to look at him the same way anymore. Every glance she cast toward him felt like a reminder of the lie that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long. The man she had married, the man she had once trusted implicitly, was no longer the person she thought he was. Richard tried to apologize, but his words seemed empty, hollow. He had always been good with words, charming, persuasive, able to win people over with his silver tongue. But now, his words felt like little more than a desperate plea to hold on to something that was already lost. "I'm sorry, Emma," Richard said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for it to go this far. I was weak. I didn't know how to stop." But Emma could no longer find it within herself to listen. His apology, though sincere in his eyes, couldn't erase the damage. It couldn't erase the feeling that, for so long, she had been living in a relationship that wasn't real. For the first time in years, Emma allowed herself to feel the anger that had been building up inside her. She let it surface in a way she hadn't allowed before. "Weak?" she repeated, her voice cold. "You were weak, Richard. How about you were dishonest? How about you lied to me for months? I didn't even know who you were anymore." Her words were sharp, but they were the truth. The person standing before her was a stranger, and Emma could no longer pretend that the life they had built together was worth salvaging. The days that followed were filled with tension and silence. Richard moved through the apartment as though he were walking on eggshells, careful not to say or do anything that might provoke Emma further. Emma, in turn, busied herself with her work, throwing herself into her career in an attempt to escape the emotional storm that raged inside her. But no amount of professional success could fill the emptiness she felt inside. She couldn't stop thinking about Rachel, the other woman who had stolen Richard's attention, his affection, his trust. Every thought of her brought waves of anger and jealousy. But more than anything, Emma felt a deep sense of betrayal. She had never questioned Richard's loyalty. She had believed in their vows, their promises to each other. But now, all of that seemed like a distant memory, a farce played out in front of family and friends. Her mind began to race with thoughts of revenge, of confronting Rachel and demanding answers. But as the days turned into weeks, Emma realized that what she needed most wasn't revenge, it was closure. She needed to understand why Richard had done what he did, why he had broken their vows. She needed to know why their marriage, which had once been built on love and trust, had become a shell of what it once was. One evening, after another tense dinner in silence, Emma finally confronted Richard once more. "I need the truth, Richard," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "What happened between you and Rachel? How did it get this far?" Richard didn't answer right away. He stared at her, his face a mask of guilt and regret. For a moment, Emma thought he might remain silent, that he might avoid the question altogether. But then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "It wasn't supposed to happen, Emma," he began, his voice shaky. "At first, it was just work. She was helping me with the project, late nights, long hours, all of that. But I couldn't help it. She was there. She was attentive. She made me feel seen in a way you stopped doing. The pressure of work, the loneliness, I became someone I didn't recognize. I didn't know how to stop it." Emma listened intently, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She wasn't sure if she should feel pity for him or disgust. But something inside her shifted as Richard continued. "I thought I could keep it from you. I thought it would stay behind closed doors, something we could move past. But the more I pushed you away, the more it became real. I don't know why I let it get this far. I was selfish, Emma, and I hurt you in ways I can't undo." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She didn't want to show him that his words still had power over her. "You think I didn't notice, Richard? You think I didn't feel the distance? I've been fighting to hold us together, but you were already gone. You chose her, Richard. You chose her over me." The silence between them was deafening after his confession. The weight of his admission hung heavy in the air. Emma didn't know what to say next. She didn't know if there was anything left to say. She could feel her heart breaking, but she also felt an odd sense of relief. Finally, the truth was out. Finally, she didn't have to pretend anymore. But even as she confronted the painful reality of their situation, Emma realized that the journey she had to undertake wasn't about Richard anymore. It was about her. It was about rebuilding her life, her sense of self-worth, and reclaiming the parts of herself that had been lost in her marriage. She had spent years allowing Richard's career to define their lives, She had sacrificed her own passions, her own dreams, in favor of the image they had built together. But now, with the veil lifted, Emma understood that she had been living someone else's life. She had let herself be consumed by the role she played in their marriage, the supportive wife, the perfect partner, while neglecting her own needs, her own desires. Over the following weeks, Emma began to slowly rebuild her life. She took time off work to focus on herself, to reconnect with the things that had once brought her joy. She started to paint again, something she hadn't done since college. She reconnected with old friends she had lost touch with and spent weekends exploring the city on her own. She felt a sense of freedom she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when she missed the idea of what her marriage had once been. But each day, Emma grew stronger. She began to understand that she didn't need Richard to define her, that her value wasn't tied to her role as his wife. She also began to process her anger, realizing that holding on to resentment wouldn't heal her wounds. She could never change what Richard had done, but she could choose how to move forward. The hardest part was accepting that their marriage was over, that the love she had once felt for him could no longer survive in the wake of his betrayal. Months later, Emma stood in front of a mirror, looking at the woman who had emerged from the wreckage of her marriage. She was different, stronger, more self-assured, but still healing. She had learned to trust herself again, to listen to her own voice, to pursue her own happiness. And when Richard tried to reach out to her, to apologize one last time, she stood firm in her decision. She had forgiven him, not for him, but for herself. She had learned that she was worthy of a love that was real, a love that wasn't tainted by lies and deceit. She was worthy of a future that she could build on her own terms. As she walked away from the past, Emma understood that sometimes the hardest lessons in life come from the deepest pain. But it was through that pain that she had learned her true worth, and that, no matter how many doors were closed, she had the power to open a new one. Behind closed doors is a story of betrayal, healing, and the strength to rebuild. It teaches us that the things we often keep hidden, whether they are secrets, emotions, or truths, can have profound consequences. It shows that the path to healing is not always easy, but it is necessary for growth. It reminds us that we must learn to trust ourselves, to value our own happiness, and to walk away from relationships that no longer serve us. Even when the journey seems impossibly hard, true strength lies in the courage to face our truths, to heal, and to move forward. After the confrontation with Richard, Emma felt a sense of numbness settle over her, as though the world around her had blurred and faded. It was as though she were existing in a vacuum, floating through the motions of her life, but no longer feeling the warmth or connection she once had. In the days that followed, Richard's attempts to make amends grew more persistent, but they had the opposite effect. Every word he spoke seemed rehearsed, calculated to make her feel sorry for him, to make her doubt her own feelings. Emma felt trapped in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, and, for the briefest of moments, a pang of guilt. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Could she ever forgive him? Could she even learn to trust him again, even if he begged? The idea of rebuilding what they had seemed almost impossible. The cracks in their marriage had spread far beyond repair, and Emma knew deep down that there was no going back. One afternoon, as Emma sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, she hesitated for a moment before getting up to answer it. When she opened the door, she was greeted by the familiar face of her best friend, Olivia. The two women had been inseparable throughout college and had weathered many ups and downs together. Olivia had always been her confidant, someone who understood her better than anyone else. "I came by to check on you," Olivia said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She smiled warmly, but Emma could tell there was concern in her eyes. "How are you doing?" Emma forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just trying to keep busy, you know." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "You're not fine, Emma. And you're definitely not keeping busy in a healthy way. You've been avoiding me for days." Emma sighed and sank into the couch, feeling the weight of the conversation she didn't want to have. Olivia sat beside her, her expression softening. "Talk to me, Em. What's really going on? For a long time, Emma remained silent, her mind a jumble of emotions. But finally, she spoke, the words coming out in a rush. Richard cheated on me with Rachel. Her voice faltered as she said it aloud. It still felt surreal, as though she were living someone else's nightmare. Olivia's face softened, but there was no judgment in her eyes, only compassion. I'm so sorry, Em. I can't even imagine how much that must hurt. But you deserve better than this. You know that, right? Emma nodded, but the sting of Richard's betrayal was still fresh. And it was hard to believe in her own worth when the person she loved most had treated her this way. I just don't understand, Liv. Everything seemed fine. We had a good life, or at least, I thought we did. How could he do this? Olivia placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. People make mistakes, Em, but this goes beyond a mistake. Richard's been hiding something from you for a long time, and that's not on you. That's on him. You're not responsible for his actions. What you are responsible for is what comes next for yourself. The conversation with Olivia was a turning point. For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a flicker of hope. A reminder that her worth didn't hinge on Richard's betrayal. She had always been a strong, independent woman, someone who had achieved success on her own merits. And yet she had lost sight of herself in the aftermath of their marriage. Emma realized that she had been clinging to a version of her life that no longer existed. The future she had imagined for herself, one of partnership, love, and trust, was gone. But in its place, she had the opportunity to rebuild, to redefine who she was and what she wanted. That evening, Emma sat down at her desk and began writing in her journal, something she hadn't done in years. It felt cathartic, a way to process the swirl of emotions she was feeling. She wrote about her pain, her anger, her fear of the unknown, but she also wrote about the strength she had rediscovered in herself. She wrote about the woman she used to be, the woman she was determined to become again. The next few days passed in a blur of reflection and quiet determination. Emma made a decision. She needed space. She needed to step away from Richard, from the apartment that had once been their shared sanctuary, and find her own peace. She began the process of renting a small apartment in a quieter part of town, far removed from the life she had once known. She started seeing a therapist, someone who could help her navigate the emotional aftermath of the betrayal and guide her through the process of healing. As the weeks wore on, Emma's emotional healing began to take shape. The dark cloud of betrayal slowly began to lift as she confronted her pain head-on. Therapy helped her process the feelings she had buried deep within herself, the feelings of inadequacy, of losing her identity in the shadow of Richard's career and their seemingly perfect life. She had spent so many years living for someone else, trying to meet his expectations, to be the wife he wanted her to be. But now, Emma realized that she had forgotten to live for herself. Her work also began to take on a new meaning. Emma had always been successful, but she had allowed herself to be consumed by the pressure to achieve, to prove herself to others. Now, with Richard out of the picture, she found herself rediscovering her passion for her career, not as a way to escape, but as a way to fulfill her own ambitions. She took on new projects at work, delved deeper into areas that excited her, and began to regain the confidence she had once had. She also started reconnecting with herself in small ways, taking long walks in the park, attending yoga classes, and rediscovering her love for painting. She hadn't picked up a brush in years, but as she sat before a blank canvas one afternoon, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The strokes of color on the canvas felt like a reclamation of her life, an expression of her own creativity and independence. One evening, as Emma was settling into her new routine, she received a text from Richard. It was brief, apologetic. He wanted to meet and talk. He expressed remorse for his actions and said he wanted closure. But Emma had already given him that. The conversation they had months ago was enough. She no longer needed his validation or his approval. She had already moved on. The text sat on her phone screen for several minutes before she deleted it. Without replying, Richard's attempts to reach out no longer had the power to hurt her. She had done the work of healing, and she no longer needed him to complete her. She was complete on her own. Months later, Emma found herself in a place she had never imagined possible. When she first discovered Richard's betrayal, she had regained her confidence, her sense of self-worth, and her independence. She had rebuilt her life from the ground up. And while there were moments of sadness, she no longer lived in the shadow of her past. One evening, as she walked through the park, she passed a couple sitting on a bench, their hands intertwined. For a moment, she felt a pang of longing for the love and companionship she had once thought she would share with Richard. But then, just as quickly, she reminded herself of how far she had come. She didn't need someone else to complete her. She was whole on her own. Behind Closed Doors is not just a story of betrayal and heartbreak, it is a story of self-discovery and empowerment. It is a reminder that the greatest love we can offer is the love we give ourselves. Betrayal, no matter how painful, does not define who we are. Instead, it is the strength to move forward, to rebuild, and to honor our own worth that shapes us. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most difficult experiences, and through them, we learn to reclaim our own lives and happiness. In the weeks that followed, Emma's life began to take on a new rhythm. The ache of Richard's betrayal was still there, lingering just beneath the surface of her consciousness, but it was no longer consuming her every thought. There were moments, quiet ones in the middle of the night, or during a particularly lonely morning, when she felt the sharp sting of his absence. But Emma had learned to accept those moments, to acknowledge the pain without allowing it to define her. Her new apartment had become a sanctuary, a place where she could breathe freely, without the weight of years of unspoken resentment. The silence was different now. It wasn't heavy with unspoken words, accusations, or lies. It was just silence, the kind that gave her space to reflect, to grow, and to rediscover parts of herself she hadn't realized she'd lost. The decision to go to therapy had been a turning point in Emma's healing. The first few sessions had been difficult. She had been hesitant to speak openly, unsure of how much she was willing to confront. But with each session, something began to shift. Her therapist, Rachel, was kind but firm, gently guiding Emma through the layers of pain she had buried for years. Emma discovered that her relationship with Richard hadn't just been a series of broken promises. It had also been a reflection of the parts of herself she had neglected, the parts that had once been full of dreams, ambitions, and self-love. Through the therapy sessions, Emma realized that her life had been defined by a pattern of self-sacrifice. She had been the dutiful wife, the perfect partner, but she had neglected her own needs in the process. She had put Richard's career, his ambitions, and his happiness ahead of her own. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped living for herself and had started living for him. She had forgotten the woman she had once been, the woman who had dreams beyond her marriage, who had desires and passions that were hers alone. As she dug deeper into these realizations, Emma's understanding of her own worth began to shift. She had spent so much time trying to make Richard happy, trying to be the wife he needed, that she had lost sight of her own identity. The woman she had been before she met Richard, the ambitious, driven, creative woman, was still there, waiting to be rediscovered. One afternoon, after a particularly powerful therapy session, Emma made a decision. She had always loved painting, a passion she had abandoned years ago. When she'd become consumed by the demands of her marriage, she would take it up again. She would create for herself, not for anyone else. The very next day, she bought a set of high-quality brushes, paints, and canvases, and set up a small studio in the corner of her living room. The first few strokes were hesitant, unsure, as though she were trying to find her own voice again. But as the colors began to fill the canvas, something inside Emma began to shift. She felt a connection to her past, to the woman she had once been before. She allowed herself to be defined by her relationship. Painting became a form of self-expression, a way to channel her emotions without words. It was freeing. At first, her work was abstract, chaotic splashes of color, expressive brush strokes that mirrored the turmoil within her. But as the weeks passed, her style began to change. She started creating landscapes, lush, vibrant scenes that felt full of life and possibility. Each painting was a reflection of her own journey, of the beauty and strength she was rediscovering within herself. The colors she used were bold, deep, and rich, symbolic of the depth of emotion she had been carrying for so long. Emma even began to dream again. Her paintings weren't just about healing, they were about creating a new future for herself. She began to imagine a life beyond Richard, a life that was entirely hers. The thought no longer terrified her, it excited her. Emma knew that she had to take steps to ensure that the life she was building now was one she could sustain. The financial independence that had once been so important to her before she married Richard was something she now had to reclaim. She started exploring new career opportunities that would allow her to combine her love for art and her professional skills. She began applying for freelance projects, hoping to carve out a space for herself in the world of design and visual arts. Her first major project came when she was hired by a small startup to design their logo and branding materials. The work was challenging but invigorating, and Emma threw herself into it with an energy she hadn't known she still had. She found herself staying up late, brainstorming ideas, sketching designs, and creating drafts. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, focused, passionate, and fully present in her own life. She also began reconnecting with her old friends. Over the years, as Richard's career had taken precedence, Emma had lost touch with the people who had once been so important to her. But now, she was re-establishing those relationships, reaching out to people she had neglected. She reconnected with old college friends for coffee, sent messages to people she had lost contact with, and found herself socializing more than she had in years. It wasn't easy. She had spent so many years living a life that revolved around Richard's world, but with each new conversation, she realized just how much she had missed the genuine connections she had once had. Despite the progress Emma had made, there was still one thing that lingered in the back of her mind: Richard. As much as she had healed, there was still a part of her that wondered whether the pain would ever fully go away. Would she always carry a piece of him with her? Would she ever fully be free of the life they had shared? One evening, Richard reached out to her again. It had been several months since their last conversation. He had sent her messages sporadically, but Emma had ignored them. This time, however, he asked if they could meet in person. He wanted closure, he said. He wanted to apologize properly and have one final conversation. Emma hesitated. Part of her wanted to tell him to leave her alone, to cut all ties and never look back. But another part of her, a part she hadn't fully acknowledged until now, felt like this conversation was necessary for her final healing. She agreed to meet him, but on her terms. She would go into this meeting not to reconcile, but to reclaim the final piece of herself that he had taken from her. They met at a small cafe, one that Emma had always liked. Richard was sitting at a corner table when she walked in. He looked older, more worn than she remembered. He stood up as she approached, a mixture of guilt and relief in his eyes. "Emma," he said softly, "thank you for agreeing to meet." Emma nodded, taking a seat across from him. The silence between them was thick with years of unspoken words, but Emma knew that this was a conversation she needed to have for herself. "I don't want to rehash everything, Richard," Emma said, her voice steady. "I've moved on. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm not even sure I want it. What I need you to understand is that I've finally found myself again. I don't need you to complete me, and I don't need your apology to heal. I've done that on my own." Richard looked down at the table, his face a mask of regret. "I never meant to hurt you, Emma. I was selfish, and I'm so sorry. I can't take back what I did, but I want you to know that I've learned from my mistakes." Emma's eyes softened, but she didn't feel pity for him. She felt nothing for him now. She had long ago come to terms with what he had done. "I know you're sorry, Richard, but I'm not that woman anymore. I'm not the woman who would have waited around for you to fix things. I'm the woman who is finally living for herself." There was a long pause as Richard absorbed her words. Finally, he nodded. "I understand. I just wanted to tell you that I wish you nothing but happiness. Emma, you deserve it." Emma smiled gently, a sense of closure washing over her. She stood up, ready to walk away. ready to leave the past behind. "Goodbye, Richard," she said softly. As Emma walked out of the cafe, she felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of Richard's betrayal no longer hung over her. She had let go of the past, and she had done it for herself. The future, she realized, was wide open, and it was hers to shape. Behind Closed Doors is a story about reclaiming oneself after betrayal. It teaches us that healing comes not from seeking forgiveness or closure from others, but from within. It shows that we must love ourselves first and honor our own worth, regardless of what others may have done to us. When we stop living for the approval of others and start living for ourselves, we discover a freedom that leads to true happiness. After her final conversation with Richard, Emma felt a profound sense of peace that she hadn't anticipated. She had expected closure to feel like a weight lifted, but instead, it felt like the beginning of something new. There was no finality in her heart. Instead, she felt a quiet confidence that came from realizing she was capable of healing herself. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Emma found herself waking up with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't waking up for someone else anymore, for their needs or expectations. She was waking up for herself, for the dreams that had been buried under the weight of a false sense of obligation for far too long. Her art became a constant source of catharsis. Painting wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was a language through which she communicated her deepest emotions. She poured herself into it, creating vivid landscapes that seemed to reflect her own growth, each stroke of color symbolizing a step forward in her healing journey. The creative process felt like a rediscovery of the joy she had forgotten was possible. Her work began to take on a life of its own, transforming into something bold and powerful, yet delicate and vulnerable at the same time. One evening, as Emma sat in front of her easel, a realization hit her. She wasn't just painting because it was healing, or because it was a reminder of who she once was. She was painting because it was what she loved. For the first time in years, she was doing something entirely for her, without compromise. There was no need for approval from anyone. But Emma wasn't just reconnecting with her passions. She was also learning to reconnect with herself socially. After so many years of isolation, her friendships had grown distant, and she had become disconnected from the people who once formed her closest circle. Olivia, however, had remained a steady presence in her life throughout the turmoil with Richard. As Emma began to regain her strength, she found herself seeking more of Olivia's company, leaning on her for support and guidance. One afternoon, as they sat in Olivia's cozy living room, the conversation turned to Emma's newfound sense of independence. "You've come a long way, Emma," Olivia said, her voice warm and filled with admiration. "I've never seen you like this before." Emma smiled faintly. "I think I've always been this person, Liv. But I buried her under the weight of other people's expectations, including Richard's. I think I lost sight of who I was in the process." Olivia leaned back on the couch, her eyes thoughtful. "It's easy to do. I've watched you live for him for years, and I knew it was draining you. But I never realized just how much you were losing of yourself in the process. I'm so proud of you for taking the steps to get back to the person you were always meant to be." The conversation shifted to Emma's future, her plans to pursue a career in art, her dreams of teaching painting to others, and her newfound sense of purpose. Olivia had always been Emma's cheerleader, but there was a level of pride in her eyes that Emma had never seen before. "I think you have so much to offer the world, Emma. You have so much light inside of you," Olivia said, her voice filled with sincerity. "You're not just going to survive this, you're going to thrive." Emma's eyes softened. She had always been afraid of stepping into the world on her own, of embracing her true potential. But now, with Olivia's support and her own growing sense of self-worth, she realized that the fear she had been carrying was just another prison. The door was wide open. It was time for her to step through it. Emma's journey wasn't linear. There were days when the weight of the past would press down on her, moments when she found herself standing at the edge of the life she was building, wondering if she was strong enough to step forward. These moments, though, grew fewer and farther apart. The more she leaned into her own strength, the less the fear had control over her. She had spent so many years measuring her worth by someone else's standards, but now she was measuring her worth by her own. Her confidence began to grow in small but meaningful ways. She'd gone to the gym a few times a week to get back into shape, and although she didn't see drastic physical changes, the strength she felt in her body was something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt empowered by her own resilience. She wasn't just healing emotionally, she was physically reclaiming her body as well. Emma had also begun traveling again, something she had loved to do before. Richard's career and their marriage had pulled her into a smaller world. Now, she found herself in new cities, standing in awe of landscapes and art galleries that sparked creativity in ways she had never anticipated. She took solo trips to museums, breathing in the rich history of art that once filled her with excitement and wonder. She took a trip to Paris, where she had always dreamed of studying art. As Emma wandered the streets of Montmartre, breathing in the history and beauty of the city, she felt connected to the world in a way that was both new and familiar. It was as if she were reclaiming a part of herself she had forgotten. She was reconnecting, not just with her past, but with the dreams she had put on hold, the person she had always wanted to be, but had been too afraid to become. Though Emma's primary focus was on herself and her growth, the idea of love lingered in the back of her mind. After all, she was human, and despite the hurt she had endured, she still believed in the possibility of love, just not the kind she had experienced with Richard. In the months that followed her trip to Paris, Emma met someone new, someone whose energy and kindness felt like a soft breeze against the walls she had built. His name was Lucas. He was an artist too, a sculptor who had a quiet, contemplative presence. Their connection was instant, but calm, gentle. Unlike Richard, Lucas wasn't interested in dominating Emma's life. He wasn't looking to fix her or make her fit into his world. Instead, he encouraged Emma to embrace her own passions and showed her what it meant to love without expectation. Lucas didn't try to erase the past. Instead, he allowed Emma the space to tell her story, to open up about her betrayal and the journey she had taken. He listened without judgment, always gentle in his response, never pushing her for more than she was ready to give. "I don't need you to heal me, Lucas," Emma had told him one evening, after a quiet dinner. "I'm already doing that on my own, but I'd love for you to walk beside me while I do." Lucas had smiled softly, his eyes full of understanding. "I'm happy to walk beside you, Emma. I'll be here for you, but I won't rush you. I understand that you need to take your time." Emma had felt a warmth in her chest that night, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't looking for a savior, and Lucas wasn't trying to be one. Their relationship grew slowly, without pressure or expectation, and Emma found herself opening up in ways she hadn't before. It wasn't the kind of love she had once imagined, one that was defined by perfection or complete dependence. It was different. It was healthy. It was whole. It was the kind of love that allowed both people to be fully themselves. Months passed, and Emma continued to build the life she had always dreamed of, one where she was in control, where her art flourished, where her heart was no longer burdened by the weight of the past. The ghosts of Richard's betrayal no longer lingered in her mind. She had truly let go. One afternoon, as Emma stood before a blank canvas, ready to begin another painting, she reflected on everything she had overcome. She had reclaimed her life from the ashes of her past, but more than that, she had found the strength to move forward without needing anyone to validate her choices. Her healing wasn't just about overcoming Richard's betrayal. It was about learning to trust herself again. It was about learning that her happiness wasn't tied to another person's actions, but to her ability to embrace her own life fully, without fear or hesitation. In Behind Closed Doors, Emma's journey is one of rediscovery, healing, and empowerment. It teaches us that true strength comes from within, that we are capable of rebuilding ourselves after life's greatest betrayals. It reminds us that, while relationships can shape us, they do not define us. Our ability to love ourselves, to pursue our passions, and to stand confidently in our own truth is what truly matters. And most importantly, It teaches us that the power to heal and grow lies in our own hands. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you enjoy, then please like and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel.